Hi everyone, and thanks for coming to my presentation at this year's Decon conference. My name is Mike Perhala, and I'm going to talk today about some of my research related to the flow and dispersion of effluent in an urban-like environment. This work was completed for my dissertation at NC State University while also working as a pathways intern at EPA. The dispersion of a released effluent or any sort of airborne substance is rather well understood for homogeneous environments, such as the one you see here on the right. Most dispersion research has been studied over flat and grassy fields with limited obstructions. In these cases, a release source is usually represented as a stack or chimney and can be expected to disperse in a near Gaussian fashion downwind. Dispersion models are commonly used to estimate the downwind concentration of a plume, although these can vary in complexity. But what about more complex situations, such as urban or industrial areas? For example, the flow and dispersion may become affected in street canyons, such as the photo that you see at the bottom of this slide. Additional research is needed in complex areas to help us better understand how wind patterns become affected by obstructions. Urban areas are also important considerations because high population densities could lead to greater risks of human exposure. Turbulent flows are generated between buildings and streets, leading to chaotic wind flow patterns. This causes changes to the wind speed profile with height closest to the surface. Normally, we would expect the wind speed to increase logarithmically with height due to surface drag. However, within a built-up environment, such as the one that you see in the figure on the right, surface drag is increased and the wind profile near the surface is reduced, creating this sort of kink right within the urban canopy layer. Buildings can also cause significant plume channeling effects, as seen in the figures on the bottom of this slide. If the prevailing wind flow occurs in line with the streets and avenues, a ground level release will generally be channeled down the street while also meandering around adjacent buildings. However, if the wind or building arrays are oriented at an angle, the plume may diverge off its expected plume axis and make it harder to predict downwind concentrations. So for this project, we aim to study the dispersion of a hypothetical plume within a mock urban environment. The design of our urban area was based off the Jackrabbit 2 field study, which was a full-scale field project developed by the Department of Homeland Security and several other agencies. It occurred between 2015 and 2016 at Dugway Proving Ground and featured an array of 80 Connex shipping containers to mimic streets and rows of buildings. To complement the field study, we completed a series of meteorological wind tunnel lab experiments, which offered a more controlled atmospheric condition to better characterize the dispersion of a tracer release within an irregular building array. Additionally, we compared and evaluated the tracer concentration measurements using a series of CFD model simulations. And finally, we tested the performance of a Gaussian dispersion model given the similar mock urban area to inform further model improvements. This research is featured in the Atmospheric Environment Journal article that you see in the tan box on the right side. All wind tunnel experiments were performed within EPA's fluid modeling facility here in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. This is an exterior view of the wind tunnel, which has supported a wide variety of regulatory modeling work and model evaluation since its inception in the early 1970s. The wind tunnel is pretty large and fits within an old indoor tennis court. Here on this slide, you can see a picture of the inside test section of the wind tunnel with myself and our mock urban model. I'm mainly here to show a size comparison with the model, which was scaled 50 times smaller than in the field study. The picture is looking upwind so that when the wind tunnel is operational, air flows through a series of flow straighteners. The flow then encounters 5 triangular Irwin spires that you see on the far upwind part of this photo. This helps develop a wind speed profile expected within the lowest portion of the atmosphere. The floor is also lined with a series of metal tabs to help develop the surface roughness and mimic the ground surface at the study site. In the wind tunnel, a neutrally buoyant tracer, which was ethane, acted as our release source. The ethane was released through a porous omnidirectional ball at various heights, but the image on the left shows that this release was at 1/5 the height of the average building height. We denote the scaled wind tunnel height measurement of 50 millimeters as H, which was 2.5 meters in full scale. To obtain profiles of tracer concentrations, a metal rake apparatus with equally spaced ports was mounted to a traverse system and moved throughout the model. An air sample was drawn through each end of the rake, through a tube, and into its respective hydrocarbon analyzer. And although it's not pictured here, we also collected a limited amount of flow measurements using a laser Doppler velocimetry system. This presentation will focus on 4 simulation cases. The first case mimicked the field study, which was called Tank after the field study release. We also completed a series of base cases by adding 6 additional buildings near the release source to represent a more methodical urban area. We then ran those cases with a CFD model called ANSYS Fluent, which was used to provide a much greater spatial detail of the plume and overall flow. We then ran 2 additional base case CFD simulations under the slightly oblique incoming wind directions of 5 and 15 degrees. The CFD model incorporated an embedded large eddy simulation, or ELES, approach to provide a much finer resolution for the areas surrounding the buildings. The grid contained a varying size hex mesh with over 21 million grid cells. Finally, to intercompare the results using various scales, all concentrations were normalized as chi, which accounts for the concentration, reference wind speed, length scale, and flow rate. This slide shows the ground level spatial behavior of the tank and the base case plumes from the CFD model. You can generally see that despite the building orientations, each plume maintains a similar width throughout the building array. However, the initial dispersion is strongly impacted depending on the obstacles directly near the emission source. One clear trend is that the downwind dispersion appears to be nearly Gaussian, despite the presence of buildings only a few streets after the release. On this slide, you can see the lateral profiles from the base 0 degree case for 2 different downwind locations, near the release and another halfway throughout the building array. In the red coloring, the wind tunnel concentration measurements are shown with the red dots, with a Gaussian plume fit in the red solid line. The CFD model concentrations are shown with the black dots and a Gaussian fit with the solid black line. These lateral concentrations are essentially slices through the plume at ground level with concentrations on the y-axis and distance laterally across the plume on the x-axis. In general, both measurements compare excellently and generally match both the peak concentration and plume widths. However, the CFD model predicted a slightly wider plume with downwind distance. The Gaussian fits also fit both datasets quite well despite the presence of buildings. In terms of vertical concentrations along the plume center line, both datasets matched incredibly well once again. As the plume propagated downwind, the buildings acted to loft the centerline concentration maximum above H, which is marked on the plot by the blue line. This slide shows the plumes under slightly oblique wind directions to demonstrate how the buildings can cause additional channeling to the plume. On the left side, you can see the spatial plume at 5 degrees at ground level, with 15 degrees on the right. The red dotted line basically plots the expected plume center line if the plume maximum were to follow the 5 and 15 degree offsets. The black line plots the actual plume center line, which shows the additional degree of channeling caused by the buildings. This plume is termed YP. At 15 degrees, you could see how the buildings cause an even greater divergence of the plume than expected. Now let's take a look at the sigma Y variable, or the lateral spread of the plume with downwind distance. This plot shows the wind tunnel measurements in red triangles, and the CFD model is plotted with red circles. In general, both datasets show good agreement and trend with downwind propagation. It's apparent that the plume spreads laterally quite quickly within the first few rows of buildings. Then the plume really doesn't develop much more than after that, past about 6 or 7 building heights downwind. Adding in the 5 and 15 degree oblique wind sigma Y lines, we can see that the relationship is somewhat similar, although the 15 degree case in blue grows a bit more consistently with downwind distance due to the plume's angled interaction with the building array. The dashed plume spread lines are plotted for reference. So I already showed the YP variable a couple slides ago, but how does it compare with the other cases? Well, here you can see that for the 0 degree cases in red, they hover around the 0 mark throughout the plume's transit throughout the building array, which is to be expected as the plume meanders through the rows of buildings. For the 5-degree oblique wind cases in green, the plume center line drifts laterally about 1 to 2 building heights. However, the 15-degree oblique wind in blue really demonstrates the offset of up to 7 building heights from the expected plume center line. This equates to an additional 5-degree offset for the 5-degree wind and an additional 14-degree offset for the 15-degree wind, which is pretty significant. Okay, so the final part of this study, since the plumes were rather Gaussian in our CFD runs, how well could a Gaussian dispersion model estimate the spatial extent of the plume for this urban area given their known value? Due to the significant user flexibility, we chose EPA's AirMod dispersion model to represent the Gaussian class of models. 2 simulation scenarios were run to most realistically represent the plume. The first model run used meteorological input that may be known without advanced observational or model data. We applied a modified method to the boundary layer wind speed profile, which was proposed by McDonald, to create the characteristic wind speed reduction within the building canopy. This then transitioned to the logarithmic law at the inflection point above H. Appropriate values for roughness length, Z0, and U star, or the friction velocity, were applied from the Jackrabbit 2 field study. The resulting theoretical McDonald profile in red on the plot to the right compares very well with the limited set of velocity data that we gathered within the wind tunnel, along with the same locations from the CFD simulation. We also implemented initial lateral and vertical plume spreading parameters based on the width and height of the buildings within the array. The first model run resulted in the AirMod plume that you see here on the left, with the base CFD simulation on the right. Concentrations are again normalized by chi for the ground level. You can see that AirMod captures the general structure of the plume but tends to underestimate the concentrations in the near and far field. This is because the plume is a bit too overspread laterally. AirMod also omits concentrations near the source release to avoid misrepresenting the results. The second model run demonstrates an improved model result using the McDonald wind speed profile, in addition to turbulence data informed by our CFD simulations. We determined that adding an input profile of sigma v turbulence data, which is the standard deviation of the lateral wind component, from the CFD data could modulate some of the lateral plume spread, since this profile is normally calculated through U star. The resulting plume is much more realistic, with less lateral plume spread that improves the concentration estimate along the plume center line. We also made small modifications to the source code to force AirMod to predict concentrations near the source. While the concentrations were a bit too low directly at the source, they were quite accurate only 2 building heights downwind, so still within the zone that AirMod would omit. Alright, so in conclusion, we showed excellent relationships between the lab and the CFD concentration data through qualitative and quantitative comparisons. We demonstrated that the buildings could cause considerable plume drift from the expected centerline axis, especially with greater wind obliquity. And despite these changes, the plume concentration distribution was still strongly Gaussian, which reinforces the fact that Gaussian models are still potentially valuable for urban and emergency response related applications. Finally, the addition of wind speed and turbulence profiles more indicative of an urban area shows improvement to the Gaussian model. Future steps include a new wind tunnel and CFD study with denser building arrays and irregular building heights. We also hope to develop an algorithm or parameterization for plume channeling or drift caused by these buildings. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge all of my colleagues at the Fluid Modeling Facility for their mentorship, project design, data collection, and analyses. I also want to thank my group at EPA, HSMMD, for their programmatic support over the past several years. A special acknowledgement also goes out to the Jackrabbit 2 team and other researchers involved. Thanks again for your attention, and feel free to contact me at the email address seen on the slide.